Hi, I'm Sherry Brooks Vinton, author of Put 'em Up, and we're here today to can some sweet pepper jam using the boiling water method. You know, a lot of people think that canning's really difficult and scary, that you're going to kill your family and friends. Well, you're really not. You can have a good time and have delicious results, and we're going to talk about how right now. For the boiling water method, a lot of people think that you need to head into the kitchen and scrub everything down with alcohol and put on your surgical mask and get really sterile. You don't have to. You just need to wash your equipment with some nice hot water and soap. And then I like to lay everything out on a nice clean towel. It gives me a fresh surface, and it also helps to pick up some of the drips because it's a fairly wet process. For the boiling water method, you need boiling water, and we're going to put some here into this canner. Now, I have a canner and a canning kit, but if you don't have one, that's okay. You can use a pasta pot, a lobster pot, anything that'll hold boiling water. It doesn't have to be a very high quality, anything will do. Now, I have a canning rack that came with my canning kit, and if you have one, that's great. But if you don't, you can use a cake cooling rack or even some of the rims that come with your canning jars. And you just want to put those in a layer on the bottom of your canner. That's going to ensure that you have a nice flow of boiling water all around the jars. So I'm going to put my canning rack into my canner. And then you want to fill your canner with jars. Even if your recipe just calls for 1 or 2 jars to be filled, you want to make sure that you're filling your canner with jars. They don't all have to be the same size, but you want to make sure that there's no chance they're going to tip over during processing. So I'm putting in my jars, and then I've filled my canner ahead with water, but if you haven't, you can just pour water into your canner to cover the jars just to the top. And that's cold water, filling the canner with cold water just to cover the jars. It's very wet work. And then you want to put your lid on top of your canner or your pot and crank up the heat and get that to a nice simmer. You're not trying to sterilize the jars at this point. You're just trying to get them nice and hot because we're going to be filling them with some nice hot pepper jam. You don't want to put hot things into a cold jar. So let's move on to our recipe. Now we're going to make some nice red pepper jam. The secret ingredient in this jam and anything that you're going to create and use the boiling water method to keep shelf stable is vinegar. You need to have the hot vinegar. You need to have the appropriate amount of vinegar in your recipe, and you need to use the kind that's indicated in your recipe. Most often that's going to be white distilled vinegar or apple cider vinegar. You have to make sure it has a 5% acidity. That's going to ensure that you have the proper pH for safety using the boiling water method. So I have my vinegar in the pot, and now I'm going to add these gorgeous red peppers that I have from the farmer's market and some onions. I just diced those up, adding those to the vinegar. And then I'm going to add a little bit of garlic and some mustard seeds, which give it a great flavor and also look really pretty in the jar. And some sugar. Just stir that up. Bring it to a nice simmer, and you're going to let that cook for about 15 minutes. While that simmers, I want to talk a little bit about pectin. A lot of fruits have pectin naturally in them. That's the protein that creates that gel-like consistency that you find in jams and jellies. But for low pectin fruits and for vegetables that have no pectin at all, like the peppers here, we're going to need to add a little pectin. You can buy commercial pectins in the grocery store. I prefer this one. It's Pomona's Universal Pectin. It acts a little bit differently than the other pectins you might find on the shelf, and here's how. When you get the Pomona's Universal Pectin, it comes in a 2-piece kit. In the kit you have the pectin powder, which is derived from citrus peels, and you also have a little packet of calcium powder. You need to mix the calcium powder with a little bit of water, as I've done here. And the calcium is going to be what activates the pectin in your recipe. What I like about that is because we're using calcium to activate the pectin, you don't have to use copious amounts of sugar in your recipe. You can even use alternative sweeteners like honey or agave syrup, and that's really cool for a lot of people that want to eliminate or reduce sugar in their diet. So I have the calcium powder here. I'm going to set that aside, and now I have half of the sugar for the recipe set aside in a little bowl, and I'm going to add the pectin that we're going to use in our recipe to that sugar and just give it a little stir. So just scooping that out, try to measure pretty carefully. You want to add the amount that's called for. And then just stir that up in the sugar to sort of spread it around. You don't want to dump the pectin right into the recipe or you'll wind up with a teaspoon-sized rubber ball. So just give that a little stir. Okay, now to use this combination of calcium powder and pectin, you give the calcium water a little bit of a shake because it kind of settles out pretty readily. And then just measure the amount of calcium water that's called for right into the pot. You don't have to use a lot. And the calcium water that you don't use for this recipe, you can put right back in the refrigerator and you can use it all jamming season long, so it doesn't really go to waste. Then give that a little bit of a stir. And then you want to sprinkle in the sugar and pectin combo. Just sprinkle it in and stir as you go. You don't want it to clump up, and if you take your time just a little bit, then you can avoid that. So you just want to stir that up to make sure that the sugar and the pectin have dissolved, and then you want to turn off the heat and give your jam just a minute or two to settle down, and that's going to give all the air bubbles that are in there a chance to rise to the top. After it's rested for a minute or two, you want to use a ladle to just get in there and skim off any foam that may have developed on the top of your jam. And then we're ready to fill the jars. Now our recipe is all finished and our jars are nice and hot and we're ready to fill them. Pull out the first jar full of water, and we're going to tip that hot water over top of the lids that we've separated out into a heat-proof bowl. Now we're not trying to sanitize the lids here, we're just trying to get them nice and hot so we can start to soften up that little rubberized band, and that'll give us a good seal. Now I'm going to use a canning funnel here. If you have a canning funnel, that's great. If you don't, you can use a regular funnel and just saw the bottom off of it to get that little bit of a V shape, or you could just use a smaller ladle. It's just helping you to be neat about your work. So dip out some of your recipe and ladle it down into your jar. And you could do a little bit of an assembly line here. You want to line up all of your hot jars and you want to ladle your recipe into all of them at the same time. And what I'm looking for when I fill them is the proper amount of head space. That is the amount of air space that is between the top of the liquid and the top of the lid. It's going to be different for each recipe, so make sure to look to your recipe for the amount of head space indicated. Now, I'm going to use a little skewer. So I'm just going to use that bubble remover, let's say, to get in there and poke around and release any trapped air, because that would affect our headspace. Then you want to take a nice clean towel or paper towel, dip it in that hot water, and just wipe the rim here. Take your time with this. You don't want to have any sort of, trapped seed or a little bit of jam up there that could interfere with a good seal. So just wipe those off, do all of your jars in turn, and then you're going to want to put the lid on with this little lid lifter or magnet tool, it's sometimes called, and here's what it does. Magic, right? So if you have a canning kit, that's what it's going to do. It's going to lift up your lid. If you don't have one of these magnet tools, that's okay. You could just use some tongs, preferably the ones with the scalloped edge, or even your fingers. If you've been cooking for a while and you have those good asbestos fingers, just reach down in there and pluck one out. You just want to be careful not to scratch this white surface here, because that could rust during storage, and that wouldn't be the best situation. So just get one of those jars out of there, one of those lids out of there, put it on top of your jar, and then you want to put the ring on, and this is really important. You just want to put the ring on fingertip tight. That means you use just your fingertips, not your knuckles. You don't want to be gripping this with your palm, no faces. Just use your fingertips to screw it down gently on top of your jar. Just pretty much until the jar starts to spin on its own. And then use your jar lifters, canning tongs, to pick up all of your jars and put them straight down into the canner. Once all your jars are loaded into your canner, you want to make sure that you have 2 inches of water to cover the top of the jars. That's going to ensure that you get good water circulation all around. Now you take your lid, put that on, and really crank up the heat. You want a good rolling boil here, almost so furious that the water starts to spit out the top of the pot. So get a good rolling boil, and then you start your timing. That's what's called your processing time. It's the amount of time that your filled jars are submerged in boiling water. Once your processing time is over, you want to turn the heat off, take the lid off, and let your jars sit for about 5 minutes. It's really important for them to rest for 5 minutes. Otherwise, some of the contents of the jar could bubble up and out of the top of the jar and interfere with your seal. So after your 5-minute rests are over, use your canning tongs to reach in there and lift your jars straight up. Now it's important not to tip that water off the top of your jar. It's so tempting to tip that little lake off, but you want to just sit it straight down on top of a towel-covered surface. The heat of the jar will cause that water to evaporate and it won't taunt you so much anymore. But it's really important not to tip it because your seal hasn't formed yet, and you could leak some of your recipe out of the jar if you were to tip that water off to the side. Let them rest for 24 hours. Within those 24 hours, generally within the first 20 minutes or so, you're going to hear a delightful little popping sound. That's the sound of your lid going from a convex shape to a concave one, and it means that your seal is forming. The next day, you need to check your seal, and here's how you do that. I have one here that's finished. You want to take your ring off of your jar of jam and just push up on that lid a little bit. You can even shake it upside down and make sure that your lid is firmly attached to the top of the jar. If you push a little and it stays for a second but then pops off, you don't really have a good seal. It really should be tightly on there. Then you want to just give a little bit of a wipe, remove any excess moisture that may still be hanging out around the top of that jar, and then you can store it just like this for up to a year in a cool, dark place. And that's the boiling water method. It's one way to put them up.